So here we are outside, and we have some dandelions that are ready to be picked. And I usually pick the ones that are fully open like this, and it makes it easier to get the petals out. And what I usually do is squeeze the bottom part because we don't want any of this green. We're just after the actual petals. Okay, so a couple of hours have passed and I've got a little bit of time here, so I'm going to go ahead and start making the jelly. And the first thing I'm going to do is strain the solids. So here's the tea that's been sitting, like I said, for a couple of hours. I have a cloth and I'll put this so this will go inside here, and I'm very carefully going to pour this in, and when I'm done I'll make sure to squeeze this and get all of the liquid out. Once I'm done with that, I'll pour 3 cups of liquid into a measuring cup and measure that out, and we should be good to make the jelly after that. Okay, so I have strained this, and you can take the solids and you can dump them outside, or in the garbage. You can compost them if you want to. I probably have 6 cups worth of liquid, so I could make a double batch of jelly if I wanted to. It just requires a lot of sugar. Something I wanted to say too is that if you get to this stage and you've made the tea, but you just don't have time to sterilize jars and to make the jelly, then you can always pour this into a mason jar or a jar and stick it in the refrigerator and do it the next day. So that's always an option too. So I'm going to move on to getting my jars washed and getting my water bath canner ready. Okay, so I have a brand new case of 8-ounce jelly jars, and according to the ball manufacturers, you do not have to sterilize these jars. You can just thoroughly wash them in hot water and soap, dry them really well, and just make sure that you do your water bath and process it for at least 10 minutes. So what I'm doing now is I'm putting all of the lids in the rings in a pot, and I'll fill that up to cover them and get it going on a low simmer. And when I pour the jelly into my clean jars, then I'll take my little magnetic wand that comes in these kits. You can see the little magnetic wand right here, and that's how you lift the rings and the lids out of the hot water. So we'll do all of that, and you have to excuse all this junk stuff that's on my table. It seems really random, but we're redoing our bathroom right now, so everything is kind of a mess, and so I decided to make jelly in the middle of the mess. But yeah, I need something fun to do. So I'm going to get these washed, and I'll be back when I get the liquid measured out for the jelly, and I've got my water bath canner going. Okay, so I have everything going. I've got my pot that I'm going to make my jelly in. I've got my lids heating up, and I have the water for the canning bath, water bath heating up. And over here, I have my dandelion tea that's ready to go. I have a pouch of, this is powdered pectin, and I've got 2 tablespoons of lemon juice and 4.5 cups of sugar. So I've got everything. So I have everything in the pot except for the sugar. We have to wait for this to come to a boil so this pectin will dissolve. And I decided to only do the 3 cups of dandelion tea simply because I didn't have enough sugar. So once I get some sugar, maybe I'll make the next batch tomorrow. I have plenty of people I can give some to, so it's never a bad thing to make extra. And I just put it in a container and put it in the fridge, and it'll keep till tomorrow. So after you've poured in the sugar and the pectin, you bring that up to a boil and you pour in your sugar, which was 4.5 cups, and then bring that up to a boil and let it boil for 1 to 2 minutes. Then we'll remove it from the heat and we'll start putting the jelly into the jars. So I've removed this from the heat, and if you buy one of these canning kits, this little funnel comes with it and fits right into these 8-ounce jars, which is really nice. So then what you want to do, and some people remove this foam at the top, you can do that, or you can just kind of stir it back in. Actually, I think that is probably what I'm going to do. You can just take a spoon and skim this off of the top before you start ladling them into the jars. Okay, now we're going to get the hot jelly into the jar. And I am probably going to turn the camera off here in a minute. I just wanted to show you. You know, this makes it super easy. I don't even have to be careful in a sense, because this funnel is really great. What you do want to make sure is that you leave enough space at the top of the jar so you can take this out, put it in your next jar, and then we have this little handy dandy measuring stick that will let you know exactly how much more you need to go to leave a 1/4 of an inch headspace at the top, which is what we're shooting for. So I still need to put just a little bit more in there. So I'm going to continue filling up all of these jars, and then we'll put them in the canner. Okay, I've got 5 jars filled, and I have wiped down the rim with a wet cloth just to get the extra jelly off. And then we'll take our little magnetic wand and get our lids that we have going and put those on. And once we get these all sealed up, then they'll go in the canner for 10 minutes. Okay, I have all of the lids on, and just make sure that you finger tighten this. You don't crank it down too much. And I had one that didn't make quite a full jar, and this will just go right in the refrigerator. So any jars that you have that are half full, just throw them in the fridge and make sure you eat them, you know, sooner than later. And I think we're ready to put these in the bath, and we're going to use this little handy dandy device. This is great for lifting the jars in and out. Make sure that you're not tipping them. You don't want any of the liquid in here to interfere with the seal of the jar. Okay, these are all in the water bath. Make sure that they're at least a 1/2 inch apart from each other. And then put a lid on, and we'll bring it up to a boil. It doesn't have to be a rolling boil, but you do want to process it, make sure that it is boiling for at least 10 minutes. Okay, so while those are processing, you can go ahead and write out your labels or make them on the printer. And when they're done, we're going to leave them in the canner. We're going to turn off the heat, take the lid off of the canner, and just let them sit in there for about 5 minutes or so. And after that 5 minutes, move them to your counter on a cloth or a wire rack or something like that. Don't put them directly on cold tile, because they're going to be super hot, and the temperature difference could be like a recipe for disaster. So move them to your counter, let them cool down, leave them there for probably 12 hours. Come back to them the next day and make sure that you test the lid with your finger. You should have no springing, no ability to push the lid up and down. If you can't, if it's nice and tight and sealed, then you can store them in your cabinet for up to a year. And they make great gifts, and you can do this with just about any edible wildflower. And One of my favorites is rose petal jelly. It tastes like, it tastes like a rose, so it's very perfumey, but it's very good. And the second part of this little tutorial, we're going to go and talk about illustrating a recipe so that you can combine your illustrated recipe along with your jelly and give it as a gift. So hopefully I'll see you in the next part. So I am back, and what I have in front of me is a note card that is made out of watercolor paper, and I bought these because I wanted the envelopes to go with them. You don't have to buy watercolor greeting cards. You can just take a piece of watercolor paper and fold it in half. My idea is that I want to give this with the jelly that we just made, and I'm going to create the artwork on the front cover of the card, and on the inside I've printed out the jelly recipe right on the card, and I find that that works best. Either stick this in the printer. I have no problem putting watercolor paper through my printer. If your printer won't take watercolor paper, you can handwrite the recipe, or you can print it on a plain piece of paper, cut it out, and then glue it into the inside of your card. But my intention with this is that they're going to be able to cut this in half, and they can keep this recipe in their binder wherever they have other recipes, and then they have a piece of artwork that they can hang, they can frame, put on the wall. And I like this. I like doing it this way because if you create a really illustrative type of recipe, it's really hard to get all of this information on the front of something. It works better with recipes like salads or that only have a few ingredients and really simple instructions. So that's what we're going to do today, and I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to start on this side. And I think it would be really cute to do a mason jar with a few dandelions in it, and I'll sketch that out on my watercolor paper, and then I'm going to go in with my watercolor, and I'm going to put the watercolor in fairly loose. And what I'll probably do after that, I have a ton of pens, some Micron pens, and these are archival and they're waterproof. And I'll probably go in afterwards and do some little details so that it looks loose and kind of sketchy and doesn't look tight and overworked. So this is supposed to be a fun little project that doesn't take too long and is something that you can give along with your jelly. And also a little tip is you can always, if you plan on giving out, let's say 10 jars of jelly, you don't have to sit down and make 10 cards. You can scan your artwork and then print it directly on your note card. And it doesn't have to be watercolor paper then if you're doing... if you're going to do a scan of your artwork, then you can just print it on regular type note cards. You can print the inside and the art. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And the supplies that I have are obviously a pencil. I have a couple of paintbrushes here, and I have my watercolor and my pens. And I think that's really about it. And you may want to get yourself a reference photo if you're not comfortable with the drawing part of it. I can put my sketch on my website. That'll be available along with the recipe. I'll put the links below. And you can head over there and print out the sketch that I've got. And I'll show you what you can do. Okay. So if I have let me find a blank piece of paper. If I sketch out something, say, and you print this out on paper, you can always take a pencil, like a 2B or softer, and scribble on the back. You want to scribble on the back of the page and get it nice and coated with graphite. Then lay it down on top of your note card and trace over this, and you'll get a nice transfer. It might be kind of faint, but it'll be enough to get you started. So I will have that, like I said, up on my website. So we're going to go ahead, and the idea is I'm going to make a little mason jar. And what I'm sketching is just a what you would call a plumb line. And that's so that I can get my I can get it fairly even on both sides. I'm not really looking for anything, you know, no perfection. And as you see, I'm holding my pencil way back here, which is really helpful if you're doing a loose sketch. You don't ever want to hold the pencil up here this tight, because then your range of movement is limited. So hold your pencil back here if you're sketching. And you can kind of measure if you want to be exact. I'm not looking to be exact, but you know, and I know that, let's see, I've got the dandelions here. I don't want to make the jar too tall, otherwise I won't have room for the flowers, and I think I've started up too high, so I'm just gonna bring this down a little bit. And I can erase those other lines once I get the jar kind of figured out here. And I am using a reference photo, and I'm not using it, you know, this isn't, I'm not trying to be exact. And what I like to tell people is that nobody's going to see the reference photo when you hand them the card. There isn't going to be a side-by-side comparison. So if you don't stay exactly to the reference photo, that's a good thing. You don't ever want to. So, okay, so you can have your jar go in if you want. That can get a little bit more tricky because you're trying to get angles correct and things like that. And, you know, maybe I won't do that. I don't know. So, and it's always, be mindful of your curves here. You know, if you flatten out these curves, then it just doesn't read correctly. And you can kind of draw your ellipses in here. Let's see. Always work on your big shapes first, and then you can start going in and adding your details. There's no sense in adding details at the get-go, because chances are good if you've done something incorrectly, you're going to have to go back and erase it, and then you've spent all this time fussing over details. So, and we want this to be loose anyway. So, and then I would just add in some lines right here. And this is actually a good reference for where my water line is going to be. And just something to note, when you're drawing these ellipses, the further below eye level it is, the more of this ellipse that you see. And as it goes up, it starts to flatten out. And make sure that your ellipses, like I said, if you're going for realistic, that these are not points. These don't turn into, this doesn't turn into a football shape. And it's the same with when you're drawing eyes also. You want to make sure that these always stay rounded. Okay, so I just have the basis for my jar. And I'm going to just draw circles here to represent the dandelions. And I don't want to draw always the same circle. You want to vary these a little bit. So you may have some that you see from the side, and maybe you have one that's kind of hanging over the jar a little bit, and you're not going to see that edge then. And see, I think I want a bunch of these in here. That way we can have some fun with our watercolor and getting really like loose with it, you know. And then maybe over here we've got one that's, let's do it this way. And you can do this with any type of flower. And if you have made this, the jelly recipe that I posted on the website, you can really do that with any edible wildflower. It's kind of the same, it's the same process. So you would take, if I went out and picked wild violets, then I would make my tea out of it first and then use that tea to make the jelly. So you can do this with any edible wildflower pretty much. Let's see. I don't know. How big of a bouquet do we want? You can do some here. And you can do some that are kind of like just poking out. You want to show some overlapping. That always helps with creating dimension. And maybe like that. And I don't want this shape here. I don't want that bouquet to look too symmetrical either. You know, imperfection is, you know, is more fun to look at. Not imperfection necessarily, but something that's not symmetrical. The eye actually gets really bored when it's looking at something super symmetrical. There's nothing to keep you interested. So then we can go ahead and add in the stems. And I think my water line is going to be about right here. And then I'm going to get rid of these lines. And we're going to go over the whole thing with eraser anyway, so that when we go over it with watercolor, you won't see those lines. And I would recommend using a hard pencil, hard lead pencil. This is an HB. You can use a 2H or something that's got a little bit of a harder lead. If you use a soft lead pencil, you'll have graphite all over what you're trying to do, and it's kind of frustrating to work with. So we can start putting in some of these stems. And the interesting thing is too, when you're working with glass, you get some weird refraction with the water in there. And so you can kind of annotate that now so that you don't forget. So if I have stem going here and I'm shifting everything over to the right a little bit, then I will make sure that I move this. And then we can just start randomly filling this in with stems. I want to make sure that the ones that are front and center that they make sense, that you can follow it all the way down. And we'll just keep adding in some stems. Do that. Something like that. And then we're going to have a bunch of other stems coming in, and we can just kind of fill this in. When somebody is looking at this, their eye will fill in the blanks. So can do something, if you want to put another flower back here, maybe. I don't like that. Okay. So there we go. We've got our little sketch. And if you want to put like a little bow around this or something, you could do that. I think I'm just going to leave mine like this. And we already know what colors we're going to use. Obviously, this is going to be yellow. I'll do some darker yellow in the center and some lighter yellows. And my glass will probably just be, I'll go in with maybe like a light blue. Like I said, this is going to be just kind of really loose, and it's not going to be super detailed. We'll add a little bit of sketchy sketch in with our pens, and that'll be really it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over this with my kneaded eraser. I'm just going to kind of dab it on here and pick up some of this graphite. So your pencil line should just be a guide. And honestly, it doesn't really bother me to have the sketch showing through. I think that just kind of adds to it. So you can decide how much of your pencil line you want showing. And I don't want to make this too light, otherwise you won't be able to see it on camera. So, all right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start laying in our watercolor. So we'll get started now with the watercolor, and I'm going to use this Da Vinci mop brush. It holds a ton of water and a ton of paint, and I've sprayed my watercolor palette so everything is nice and wet. And what I'll do is I will probably start with the stems possibly, and then I'll let that dry and we can work on the flowers, and then I'll go back and work on the jar a little bit. The jar is not going to be too major. We're going to drop in a couple of maybe blues, grays, and purples just to kind of annotate that there's a glass jar there. Nothing, like I said, nothing major. And I'm not going to worry about retaining any whites, because I know that I can always go back in with some, let's say, gouache or some white ink, and if I feel like I need to add maybe a highlight on the jar, I can do it like that. Or I can take my pencil and just, you know, I'll draw a little circle here to kind of remember, and if I forget, no big deal. So let's go ahead and get some paint going here. And you can see in my palette, I've already got some dried paint. And I feel like that dandelion stems are not quite this color, so I'm going to add in a little bit of this yellow. And I think it's getting there. And you can always do like a little, you know, test if you're not sure about the color. So I'm going to go and just start laying in some of these stems. And you can drop in a little bit of a, you know, a darker color too. The one thing that I am doing, and like I said, if you forget to do this, you can always go back in with some white ink. I'm going to be mindful of where my water line is. That's usually where you pick up some highlight. So, like I said, if I forget, no big deal. Well, that got a little bit whiter than I wanted. But like I said, the intention behind this is to keep it fairly loose. I don't want something that looks like I, was slaving over it for a couple of hours. I'll save that for my bigger pieces. So, yeah, I'm just trying to vary the color a little through here. Don't be afraid to let stuff bleed into each other. I always think that looks really nice. And again, a little bit wide, a little bit wider than I wanted. I am going to pick that up with my paper towel because it's just gotten something else you can do is make sure you have your paper towels handy. And I'll let that dry for a second and then go back in. And you won't even notice it after we lay in, when we go over this, like with the grays and the blues for the glass. You can keep your paper towel handy to fix mistakes like that. And Q-tips also work really well for picking up small areas. Not sure what happened here. Go all the way up. And I think what I'll do is I'll wait until I get the flowers in, and then I'll pull the stems from there, because I want the stems to be underneath the head of the flower, not on top of. And it's just easier to find that after you have the flowers in, I think. So see, I covered up, no problem. Won't even notice. I can just add in a few kind of random stems here and there too. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I know it doesn't really look like much now, but okay, I'm gonna mix up some yellow, and I think I'm gonna wipe some of these out. I've got a lot of blue going on in here and some darker colors that would just muddy up my yellow, so I'll just take my paper towel and clean some of these out. Okay. So I think this is a quinacridone gold. Most of the watercolors that I'm using in this palette are Daniel Smith, excuse me. And I love his paint. Paint's wonderful, and I love some of the granulation that you get in some of the colors like the Cascade Green and the Shadow Violet's really nice, and just all of the colors really. The Pink Opera is one of my favorite, or Opera Pink. And you can pick it out. I mean, it's like super vibrant. Anyway, we're not going to be using that today, but all right. So I'm going to get this kind of watery. And I'm going to go in and I'm just going to start laying in. Loosely these dandelion shapes. And, you know, like we know what a dandelion looks like, or what the shape of it is. So I am leaving some white space in between. I don't want to completely, you know, and I just splattered a little bit, and actually that might be something that we do at the end. So I'm going to leave that. Splattering's not a bad thing. And something else that I might do when we get down to the jar is I may add in some salt into the watery part of the jar so that we get some fun textures. Now this is a little bit wet down here. I mean, it's starting to puddle. I'm going to add in some of this darker yellow into what I think might be the centers of the dandelion, just to give it a little bit of dimension. And then I'm going to dry my brush off on my paper towel, and I'm just going to kind of stick it in the edge right here and soak up some of this. And the nice thing about this is that you have all of these random shapes, and we can kind of pick those out a little bit with the pen at the end, and that'll help make sense of the shapes. And this has gone a little bit haywire down here, so I might add a little more yellow. So that it looks like there might be another one underneath there. And so I'm going to let this dry. I'll probably hit it with the blow dryer so we can dry it pretty quick. And then I'm going to lay in the stems right here, and then I'll work on the jar. So this is dry now, and what I'll do is I'll go in and very carefully add in some of my stems. And now that we have the yellow part of the flower in, and you can see my sketch lines, and I like the way that it looks, actually. This is going to be a loose piece, so it doesn't, I think it adds to it. But I'm going to add the stems in, and I'll probably stop. I think I'll go all the way into the rim. I'm just talking to myself now, trying to figure out what I'm doing. But I still have this green mixed up. And I'm just going to loosely add in these stems and try to make them match up with what I've got in the bottom of the jar. And I'm being a little bit careful when I get to the rim You can be a little bit more precise if you're using the tip of the brush as opposed to the flat edge. Not flat edge, but the side kind of. May drop a little yellow in there. A bit darker green. Don't forget up here, when you have some of these white spaces, you can pop a little bit of green in there to kind of show the stems, kind of like a tree. So when you get to a point where you feel pretty good, I think I'm going to add in some right there. And this little guy, I feel like he needs a stem. Something like that. I'm going to do the same thing. I might drop in a little bit of a darker green over here. Okay. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'll start on the jar. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start on our jar now. And I have some blue floating around in my palette, and I'm just going to add some water to it. It's actually starting to turn a little green, which is not a big deal. You're not actually painting the color of your jar, which most times is clear. You're painting really the reflection of the objects that are around the jar and what kind of color they're casting. So you can pretty much use any color. I like to stick with the blues and the grays and some purple. Let's see. So I'm just kind of dulling this blue color down a little bit. And I want this to be really, I don't want this to be a really saturated color. I just want a kind of a hint. So I'm going to add a lot of water to this. And maybe a little bit of this lavender. Maybe, let's see what this does. Because I can always go back in while it's wet, and I can drop in some other colors, which is probably what I'll do. And I mean, like I said, I'm going to try and be mindful of my waterline here. And yeah, probably will pick up some of your green, but that's okay because they're in the water and they add to the color of the jar. Up here, you probably want to be a little more careful because this is the part that doesn't have the water in it, right? And this is where I had that highlight that I wanted to keep. That may be, well, that isn't what I wanted to do, but okay. That's actually what I was trying to do, is pick up another piece of paper towel, and it just did it for me. Okay. I'm just very carefully going along the bottom edge because I don't want to lose this ellipse in here. I want this to stay here. Usually the side of the jar, you get usually a nice highlight on that end. Again, I'm going to make this really watery. And maybe I will add in a touch of green back here. I think people have a misconception that glass is really hard to paint, and actually it's not. I think it's more about the highlights that you add in at the end, and I think if you keep it really, if you keep glass really loose, it usually reads correctly, and then people will think you're amazing for painting glass. So I'm going to add a little bit in back here. And I had talked about, I'm not sure if I did talk about it yet or not, but I was contemplating adding in just some salt to kind of give a little bit of a little bit of texture, and I'm just adding this in to give a little bit more definition and going right over top. Just a little. And I do have some salt here. This is actually pink Himalayan salt, and it's fairly small. So I'll drop that in. And I was looking at the flowers, and I think what I'm going to do, I think I might go in with a little bit more yellow. I might add a little bit of, maybe a little bit of purple to it, which will kind of knock this yellow back. It'll mute it, and usually turns into a really nice brown. And these are complementary colors, and that's why that works. So yellow and purple. And I think I'm gonna kind of pick out some of these flowers in here that are behind or underneath, like right here. And I'm just gonna make a little bit of an indication of a shadow. Maybe right here. It's a bit too soupy. Back here. And this just adds a little bit of dimension to the painting without it getting super tight. I'm going to kind of and maybe right there. And I might drop in some more of this gold color. And this is the original yellow that I started with. I'm just going to put another layer over some of these that I feel like could use a little oomph. There, I think that looks much better. So we'll let this dry down here with the salt, and when it's dry, we'll brush the salt off, and we should have some nice texture in here. Then we'll go back in with our pen and kind of add some little sketchy designs. And oh, I did want to do, let's put in our splatter. And I know a lot of people kind of freak out when you talk about splattering, because we just spent this time painting it, especially if you're at a place where you really, you really like it. But I think this just helps with the whole like keeping it loose theme. And try not to let your paintings get to the point where it's like you're afraid to try something, because you can always pull out another piece of paper and do it again, and practice is always a good thing. Let me get this off of there. What I might do too, while this is a little bit wet still, is I'm going to go and grab some of my shadow violet or a gray, kind of a purple, and I'm just going to add a little bit of I'm just going to pull some of this paint that's wet still and add a little bit of a shadow here, right? Like that. And maybe I'll drop in a little bit of this blue and make sure that that's round. Something like that. And we'll add in some of this blue. And we've got to kind of anchor our jar down to the ground so we can we'll add this in at the bottom like it's the base of the jar, and this is where it would be naturally darker anyway. And I'm just kind of, at this point, I'm picking up just like random blue colors. I'm just kind of letting that bleed right into the shadow I just made. There. And I think I'll go in with another color, maybe a little bit of the green that we had earlier. I'm not exactly sure what I used, but I think it was this. And I'll just do a couple little splatters of that. And I'm just really loading up my brush and just tapping. And it's okay if you get it on the dandelions. So okay, so now we've got to wait for all of this to dry, and the finishing touch will be going in with a little bit of pen work and maybe some white ink or white gouache to add a couple of highlights. So we're back now, and this is dry, and I've rubbed all of the salt off of this. And I think what I'm going to do is there are a few areas that I would like to actually darken up a little bit. And the first one is this right under the water line. I want to add a little bit of dark. I'm going to keep this area light, and I'll probably do the bottom of the jar just a little bit darker and maybe underneath the rim, just kind of to add a little more contrast so you actually can tell what's what. So I'm going to get a little bit more of this. I think this is phthalo blue. And I think I'm going to add maybe, I don't know, a little bit of, I want to darken this up a little. So this is, I think, shadow violet. I'm not sure. I'm just trying to make this a little bit more of a neutral and push it into the gray a little bit, maybe. Okay, so that's pretty dark. That's pretty dark. So I want to make sure I've got, you know, some water in there so it's not quite super saturated. And I'm going to start by just laying in this bottom ellipse down here. And I've kind of veered off into my shadow. So I'll just get my handy dandy paper towel and kind of blot that up a little bit. And while this is still wet, I'm gonna rinse my brush out. I'll keep the brush wet and kind of run along the edge. And what that does is it prevents a hard line. So you're just softening the edge up a little bit. And I'm doing the same thing on the outside. I just want it to be kind of a nondescript, you know, value down there at the bottom, just so that we know that that is actually the bottom of the glass. And I'm going to do a little bit of the same. I'm going to be a little bit more precise right here when it comes to the water line. And I can do a little bit down like this. Yeah. That got away from me a little bit. Again, I'm just kind of going over that. I may add a little bit right here. You can kind of do this in some random areas. And what it does is pushes everything that's like the stems, it'll kind of push them back into the glass a little bit. So they look like they're behind the glass and not necessarily on top of. Same thing here. I'm going to put in a couple of these lines. Nothing major. You still want this to look loose. You don't, we're not going for a hyper realistic photo here. And that's something that I think through the years, as I have been painting and drawing, I'm always in awe of the people that can recreate a photo flawlessly. And it's a definite mastery of technique. But at the same time, I think to myself, why not just take a photo? I think that working loose like this, there's a lot more expression. and I think a lot more of the artist's style comes through instead of trying to recreate a photo. Glass is always really fun to paint. And since we have dandelions in there, you could actually add a couple of little bits of yellow, you know. There, I feel better about that. I might go back in just a little bit right here on the edge. You can also use colored pencils to do some of this detail work at the end if you don't want to go back in with watercolor. And the colored pencils are a little bit more precise. But I really wanted this to be a fun kind of a loose painting. So, okay, I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so that we can go in with the pen like I promised. So I'll be back in just a sec. This is dry now, and I can go in with my pen. And I showed you earlier that I have some micron pens, and I also have this pen. It's a carbon ink pen, and I love the nib on it because it creates a really fine line, and you can do some really nice sketchy type work. I'm going to try it on this paper. We'll see if it how it takes on watercolor paper. Usually when I'm working, if I'm doing a mixed media piece, this pen doesn't want to play nice depending on what I have on the surface. It should be fine on this, but I'm going to go in with this. Otherwise, if I didn't have this pen, I would just use a really fine tipped micron pen, or use whatever you have, or you can stick with a colored pencil too. So like I said, this is going to be yeah, I don't know if this pen's going to work. There it is. And I think I hit some salt. And I am not trying to stay in the lines with this. Or I should say, I'm not trying to totally follow the watercolor exactly. Oh, how I wish you would work on this paper, but it doesn't want to play. So we're going to try something else, and if I can find... This is it's a 01 micron, and I always have to test this on a different piece of paper. I'm never sure how dried out my pens are. Okay, so this will work nicely. The thing with going in afterwards with a pen, if you try to follow your watercolor to the T and try to make it really perfect, you're going to lose that loose, sketchy look. So, you know, when you're doing this, you can just like, I'm not going to get too detailed. I'm not going to I'm literally sketching with the pen, and I'm just adding some definition. You have to kind of decide which stems you want in front, which ones you want in back. You know, you can add little dots down there. Yeah, like I said, I'm going to keep this really loose and sketchy. And when you're working like this, it takes on a really illustrative kind of a feel, which is fun. And I think it alleviates a lot of the pressure of trying to come up with something that's, like I said, some photorealistic thing that that requires a lot of energy. And we're just trying to make something fun for a gift. And now I'm going to go in with these dandelions and kind of separate these out a bit and give them a little bit of shape. And something interesting about dandelions is that these petals on the dandelion, they're actually each a flower within themselves. And when you look at them, when they go to seed, when they're real puffy, each one of those little parts has a seed on the end of it. So like I said, I'm keeping this loose and sketchy. Don't want to completely, totally outline every piece of the dandelion, because the eye naturally does that. When you look at impressionistic art, there are a lot of details that are left out because the eye will fill all of that in for you. And you don't need to go crazy with detailing stuff. Just add in whatever you think is the most important element. You might think, you know, maybe some of these petals. And you know, on this part, you can really just, you know, do your own thing. And I really love dandelions, and one of the reasons that I do is I think they're, you know, kind of like the unsung hero, and the only reason that they're referred to as a weed is people have not been able to rid them of their yards, and they don't want them in their yards, and I'm not sure why. I mean, they're a really pretty flower, and not only are they pretty, but I mean, I love seeing a field that's just like full of dandelions. But dandelions are extremely medicinal. You can use every part of the flower, from the root to the stem. The leaves are edible. You know, the French and in Europe, I mean, they eat a lot of dandelion salad. It's really good for your kidneys. It's diuretic. And, you know, not only is it medicinal, but it's edible. You can actually take the heads and you can make dandelion fritters out of them, batter them, and put them in oil and fry them. And of course, I pick them and make jelly out of them. But it's an extremely powerful plant, and you can make tinctures out of the root. There's all sorts of things that you can do. So I'm not quite sure why we try so hard to get rid of it. I think if people worked with plants more, they would have a more of an appreciation, you know. And if you're interested in studying plants, this is definitely one that you should start with. It's something you can do with your kids. And plant identification is always, always something I always feel like people should know what's growing in their backyards. You can use certain plants for bug bites, things like that, like plantain. You just take a piece of it and kind of chew it up in your mouth and put it on the bug bite. I mean, these are great things to know if you're camping, you're outside. It's a good thing to teach your kids, you know. We should be familiar with the world that's right outside of our back door, and I think too many people are either afraid of it or feel like they just don't have the time, and it's not, these things aren't important. But this is the planet that we live on, and I feel like it's a really important thing. You should be familiar with nature. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it at that. I have kind of sketched my dandelions in, and I'm happy with the way that this looks. It's still loose, and I think you can tell what it is. Be sure to, sign your name somewhere or put your initials. And then on the inside of this card, oh, I did want to do a couple little pops of white before I forget. So what I have here is, this is Dr. P.H. Martin's pen white, and you can also, there's white ink that you can use. You can use white acrylic or gouache, and what I might do is just go in and kind of strengthen this highlight right here. And go all the way, I'm going to go down all the way. And then I'm going to do some here on the rim. And I think maybe along the water line. I need to find a place where I try to create some contrast if I'm going to throw in a couple of highlights, so you want to be able to see them. So maybe we put a couple right here, and maybe over here on this water line. Like I said, it also helps to kind of push the stems back into the background when you lay these highlights on top. And like, that'll wait for me a little bit. There, I think that works. And what I would do now on the inside is I would probably write something in here like, cut this card in half, hang the artwork, and save the recipe, something like that. And that's it. We've created not only a jar of jelly to give, but we've also created a fun little watercolor card to go along with it. And I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll be back with some more lessons in the future. Thanks for watching.